For centuries, royal families twisted their bloodlines to keep power pure, but in doing so, they created kings who became living curses upon their thrones. Their jaws jutted forward, their tongues swelled too large to speak, and their bodies decayed while they still breathed. Among them was a Habsburg king, perhaps the most deformed monarch in history. These are not legends. They are history's darkest truths. Watch until the end to witness the most deformed king ever born. But before we unlock these horrors, click like and subscribe to join history's hidden horrors, where the past never rests in peace. They were crowned with gold and draped in velvet, but beneath the silk robes and jeweled regalia lay bodies twisted by centuries of forbidden unions. These kings were not merely deformed, they were living proof of a royal obsession turned to rot. Today, we will descend into their stories from those whose legs rotted away, while they still ruled to those whose tongues suffocated their final words. Each of these kings carried a curse written in blood. So let us begin our descent into the top 7 most deformed kings in history. At number 7 is Emperor Leopold of the Holy Roman Empire, a ruler whose very face became the signature of his family's doomed bloodline. Born in 1640 to Ferdinand III and Maria Anna of Spain, Leopold was the product of an uncle-niece marriage, a union celebrated as purity of royal blood. His mother, Maria Anna, was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, linking his genes back upon themselves in an endless loop of cousin and sibling marriages. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that his lips could not close. His teeth protruded in a permanent grimace, giving him an expression that terrified foreign ambassadors upon first sight. His tongue, trapped behind the jutting jaw, forced his speech into slurred, gurgling echoes of meaning. Courtiers strained to interpret his words, terrified to ask for repetition. Beyond his twisted face, migraine split his skull with blinding pain, leaving him curled in dark chambers, whispering desperate prayers to a god he feared had cursed his dynasty. Painters softened his deformity, capturing downcast eyes beneath an oversized powdered wig, but no brushstroke could hide the truth. This was a man sculpted by incest into a face, both pitied and feared, and still, despite agony embedded in every bone, he fathered 16 children, continuing a bloodline that would collapse under the same curse that twisted his jaw. At number 6 is King Charles IV of Spain, a monarch whose inbred bloodline left him nearly blind, ruling through shadows and whispers. Born in 1748 to Charles III and Maria Amalia of Saxony, Charles IV carried within him the diluted remnants of centuries of incestuous unions. Though his deformities were less grotesque than his ancestors, his body remained frail, his mind dull, and his eyes clouded by cataracts before he reached 50. By midlife, he could no longer see faces clearly, only flickering shapes within dim candlelight. Courtiers exploited his blindness. Ministers forged documents and guided his trembling hand to sign decrees he could not read. Even his own wife, Maria Luisa of Parma, ruled in his name, while he wandered palace halls in confusion, squinting at tapestries he could no longer admire. Physicians applied leeches to his temples to restore humors, leaving purplish scars across his thinning skin. His trembling fingers fumbled rosary beads late into the night, whispering prayers he barely remembered. Behind closed doors, servants called him the Blind King and pitied his slow decay into darkness. He died nearly sightless, leaving Spain weakened and broken, ruled by shadows, long before his body gave way to death. At number 5 is Emperor Ferdinand of Austria, a ruler whose throne became his deathbed. Born into the Habsburg dynasty's twisted bloodline, Ferdinand was cursed before his first breath. His mother was Maria Anna of Spain herself, the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria. In this single union, generations of cousin marrying cousin converged, creating a child whose body was a map of genetic ruin. His legs, malformed from birth, could barely hold him as a child. By adulthood, ulcers festered along his calves and thighs, rotting the flesh beneath layers of royal silk. Courtiers whispered that even the perfumers could not mask the sour stench drifting from his chambers. He ruled lying down. Cushions propped his bent spine as servants tucked golden sheets around his decaying legs. They placed the imperial scepter in his trembling hand, while ministers approached with bowed heads and scented cloths pressed discreetly to their noses. Each morning, doctors drained pus from his ulcers into silver bowls. Ferdinand would stare blankly at the frescoed ceiling's lips moving in silent prayers to a god who had long abandoned the Habsburg blood. Outside his chamber, generals spoke of war and treaties, but inside the emperor's world collapsed into pain, rot, and silence. This was the legacy of inbreeding. Centuries of royal arrogance condensed into swollen limbs and festering flesh. His final decree was spoken from his back, his voice thin and shaking. And when he died, they buried him beneath slabs of white marble, etched with triumphal titles. But no stone could hide the truth that his kingdom decayed with him, from blood to bone to throne. At number 4 is King Philip III of Spain, a monarch whose own tongue betrayed him. Philip the Thwart was born from a family tree so tightly knotted that branches folded back upon themselves. His parents, Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, were uncle and niece. This union of blood was celebrated by royal advisors who believed it preserved divine purity. But purity here meant decay. From childhood, his jaw jutted forward unnaturally, a grotesque inheritance of the Habsburg jaw that marked generations before him. His tongue grew too large for his mouth, forcing him to speak in muffled, slurred words that dripped with saliva. Courtiers would bow their heads to hide the horror in their eyes as he spoke each word, a gurgled struggle. At banquets, he would choke on meat he could not chew, coughing violently as servants rushed to pat his back eyes wide with fear of witnessing a king suffocate before their eyes. Wine dribbled down his chin as he tried to drink with dignity, only to stain his lace collar dark red. Behind the velvet curtains of his chamber, doctors debated how long his heart could endure the strain. The tongue that suffocated his words also choked his breath at night, leaving him gasping in silken sheets embroidered with gold thread. His wives wept silently, for each child he sired carried the same cursed blood, and many were born twisted or died in infancy. This was the price of power, guarded by incestuous obsession. A king unable to command with clarity, whose every word was swallowed by the flesh of his own deformity. When he died, artists painted him with lips-closed jaw hidden beneath an immovable beard, erasing the truth that he ruled a kingdom he could barely speak to. Coming in at number 3 is King Charles I of Spain, a monarch whose jaw became his prison. Born to Joanna of Castile and Philip the Handsome, Charles inherited the Habsburg jaw in its most monstrous form. His lower jaw jutted so far forward that his upper teeth never met the bottom row. Chewing became an ordeal of grinding pain and mangled food. Speaking was worse. His words came out distorted, slurred, and wet with saliva that dripped constantly from his twisted lips. Courtiers learned to decipher his speech through context and prayer. They nodded solemnly, even when they understood nothing, too terrified to ask for repetition. The royal scribes tasked with recording his decrees filled pages with uncertain words, unsure if they were documenting royal will or meaningless syllables. Meals were spectacles of pity. Servants cut his food into mush, placing spoonfuls into his mouth, while he chewed with open jaws, eyes downcast to avoid witnessing the horror of a king who could not eat alone. Wine spilled down his chin, soaking into his beard, until it smelled sour by evening. Doctors examined him in hushed dread, tracing his deformity back through centuries of cousin marriages. Each generation had sharpened the Habsburg features into a grotesque caricature of power. And still, they insisted this was noble blood. When he died, painters worked tirelessly to hide his jaw, capturing only the stern gaze of a ruler who could never fully close his mouth. But no brushstroke could erase the truth that his family's obsession with pure bloodline had birthed a king who could barely speak to his own people. At number 2 stands King Charles VI of France, remembered not for conquest or glory, but for the terrifying madness that consumed him. Born from generations of royal intermarriage, Charles VI inherited more than just the throne. As a young king, he was known for his beauty and grace. But by the age of 24, dark cracks began to split his mind. His blood, corrupted by centuries of incestuous unions, carried secrets that would unravel his sanity. It began with tremors in his hands. Then seizures shook his entire body, leaving him gasping on marble floors as his courtiers watched in horror. At times, he could no longer recognize his own wife or children. He screamed that they were demons, come to drag him to hell. His palace became a prison of screams. Every night, servants heard him thrashing in his chamber, howling like a wounded animal. He believed his body was made of glass, forbidding anyone from touching him. In fear, he would shatter. Courtiers walked beside him with padded gloves, terrified of provoking another fit of madness. Royal physicians bled him endlessly, slicing open his arms to let the bad humors escape. They applied leeches to his temples until bruises bloomed across his pale skin. But nothing silenced the voices clawing at his mind. Nothing calmed the terror in his eyes as he stared into mirrors, unable to recognize the face of a king. His reign became theater. Ministers ruled in his name, while he hid in locked chambers, trembling in velvet robes soaked with sweat. France fell into chaos under a monarch too broken to speak a single order. And when he died, they buried him in silence, as if the entire kingdom wished to erase the memory of a king whose screams haunted their dreams. Finally, at number 1 is Charles II of Spain, the most deformed king in history, a monarch whose very existence was a living autopsy of his family's sins. From the moment he was born, midwives recoiled in horror. His head was monstrously large, his tongue so swollen it lolled from his mouth, and his body weak and trembling. He could not speak until he was 4. He could not walk until he was 8. Yet this was the child destined to inherit the Spanish Empire, a boy already rotting from the inside. Charles II was the product of nearly 200 years of relentless Habsburg inbreeding. His family tree folded inward so many times that his parents shared more genes than brother and sister. Every meal was agony. His massive jaw could not chew properly, so he swallowed soft mush spoon-fed by servants. Saliva dripped constantly from his lips onto robes embroidered with gold thread. His breath smelled of decay. Courtiers bowed low to avoid the sight. His mind was trapped in infancy, even as his body withered into adulthood. He believed witches cursed him. Priests performed exorcisms in candlelit chambers, chanting prayers as he convulsed on marble floors, eyes rolling back in his skull. Each seizure stripped away another fragment of lucidity until only a husk remained. A body barely alive kept breathing to keep an empire from collapse. He married twice, but remained childless. The court whispered that his seed was dead before it left his rotting flesh. As Spain's enemies closed in, ministers propped him up on the throne, his swollen tongue too heavy for speech, his gaze vacant and wet with tears. He could not explain. When he died at 38, an autopsy revealed a body unfit for life. His brain was shriveled. His heart was the size of a walnut. His lungs corroded, his intestines gangrenous. And yet, until his final breath, he wore the crown of Spain, a crown resting upon the most deformed monarch the world has ever seen. Power built upon twisted bloodlines always carries a hidden price. These kings ruled over empires that spanned continents, commanding armies and deciding fates with a flick of their trembling fingers. Yet their own bodies betrayed them from birth. Warped jaws that could not speak, legs too weak to stand minds, decaying into screams and darkness. They were crowned as gods, but died as warnings. Their thrones became altars to genetic sin, each deformity a testament to royal arrogance. In the end, no title could save them. No scepter could lift their heads from the rotting pillow. No jeweled robe could hide bones bent beyond nature's mercy. And so their corpses lie beneath slabs of marble inscribed with glory, while their true legacy festers in hidden autopsy notes and erased portraits. Because all power crumbles at the grave's edge. Kings rot, thrones turn to dust, bloodlines end in silence. These were not legends, they were living curses, and now they remain as nothing more than silent bones beneath forgotten stone.